So my name is Emmanuel Benejayi. I'm the director of the Borders and Globalization Laboratory, and I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lankan speaking people on whose territories the University of Victoria stands, and Songhees and Vasanek people whose relationship with the land continues to this day, and say that on a very beautiful day like today, a settler, new immigrant and settler to Canada, like me, is feeling very, very lucky to live here. We have this afternoon, we have as our speaker um, um, on borderlines and global flow, the future of border management and security is not what it used to be. We have Ben Rohrbaugh, who is a fellow at the Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas. He's also the co-founder of Stanaga Group, a humanitarian response company. And he has worked for Homeland Security. He's worked with Alan Bersin in the past, and published a book a couple of 3-4 years ago on some of the issues that he's discussing with us today. I'm delighted to have Ben with us today. I think it's an outstanding transition between the core of the institute that you have just been taking, which is about how people manage borders, peaceful borders across the Western world mostly, and understanding how borders function in a way are evolving, right? Looking at how it's evolving in the area of custom and the area of immigration, and how all of this obviously transforms our understanding of bordering. And the whole issue being, do we still impose, and as a policy, do we still impose and have to deal with the boundary line? To what extent the boundary line, custom houses, immigration checkpoints are really relevant to today's borders, and how the policies are basically evolving around this old assumption that you cross the border at the border crossing, or you cross the border before or after. How does all of this work? And with that, I want to ask you all to take maybe 10 to 15 seconds to introduce yourself very briefly to Ben. It would be really great if we could start right away online. Ekaterini, do you want to take the floor and introduce yourself briefly, please?
Yes, hello everyone. Nice to be with you again. I am a customs officer in Greece in an island called Lesbos. I'm looking forward to hearing you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ekaterini. Getahun, do you want to be the next one, please? And then I'll go to Tatiana. Getahun,
okay.
Please.
Okay. My name is Getahun Mengesha. I'm from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I'm a customs senior expert and finance officer, and I'm here to. Sorry, I'm interested in international trade, border management, and I want to just know about its impact on the country, nation's economic development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Getahun. Tatiana, we are, if you could unmute and take the floor, please take the floor. Jafet, do you want to take the floor and introduce yourself, please?
Hello, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's almost midnight here. My name is Jafet Chiradza from Zimbabwe, Southern Africa. I'm a trainer by profession. I work for the Zimbabwe Revenue Authority, and I'm also a part-time researcher interested in public policy, trade, and border control, border management, and border security. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Faith Mathenge, do you want to introduce yourself briefly, please?
Thank you. My name is Faith Mathenge, customs practitioner, Kenya Revenue Authority, currently a program officer at the WCO Regional Office for Capacity Building. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mora Obogi, please take the floor.
Hi everyone, my name is Mora Obogi. I'm a customs officer at Kenya Revenue Authority. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move to people who are in the room with me, and maybe we can start with Onome.
Hi. Hello, my name is Onome. I'm a research assistant working with the Borders in Globalization Laboratory here in University of Victoria. Thank you.
David?
Hello, I'm David Monty. I'm the head of a digital agency in Vancouver. We specialize in knowledge bases, expert systems, portals, websites. We've worked with a number of international organizations, including the UN and big labs. And my goal is to expand my expertise in digital systems to more of the context behind it, such as borders.
Thank you so much. Avani, please.
Hi, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm Avani. I'm from Sri Lanka and I work for the Department of Sri Lanka Customs. And currently I'm working with the directorate called the Industries and Services, which closely work with the trade and like the collaborations with the customs. Thank you.
Super Edison, please.
My name is Edison Introvini. I'm from Brazil, currently as a deputy coordinator of the Brazilian Customs and also coordinator of the Technical Committee number 2, Customs Issues and Trade Facilitation.
Okay, and one last time I'm asking Lauren, if you are with us, please introduce yourself.
Oh, hi there. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Very well.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, I'm Lorraine Latek, Chief of Operations here in Vancouver Island, Canada. I am based out of the Victoria office, but my area of responsibility includes the entire island, so many marine communities here, and I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Ben, the floor is yours now for the next, 2 hours and 45 minutes. Please take us away. Thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. And I will do my best not to talk for a full 2 hours and 45 minutes. But it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you and to be talking about borders, and to be talking specifically about the future of borders and the way they've evolved and the way that authorities are having to adapt their strategies, which I know all of you are a part of. I'll say I particularly enjoy these sessions and being able to talk with this group at the University of Victoria because of the breadth of perspectives that people bring. I teach quite a bit at the Naval Postgraduate School in the United States, which is in beautiful Monterey, California. There's a center there for Homeland Defense and Security, and it's sort of a mid-career, a place for mid-career master's degrees for first responders, law enforcement, a mix of state, federal, and local levels of government. And it's nice to talk to this group particularly because the discussions around borders can be very technical a lot of the times. People think that customs issues or the way or migration issues are very, very focused on things like compliance and the specifics, the incredibly intricate specifics of different legal systems and how things match up and requirements. And all that is true in a sense. All that is very much true. There are incredibly complicated regulatory environments that people can spend lifetimes learning and adapting to. But at the same time, I think what gets lost is that borders are so interesting in a strategic sense, and the way that borders have evolved in the way that they work and the way that they need to be understood in order to develop strategies that make sense in the modern world is really exciting. And it's something that I enjoy talking about. And I think, I'll be very interested when we get to the practicum part on all of your perspectives on how we can develop strategies that work in these spaces, because to a large extent, it's still sort of an open question. We've gone through a series of shifts that I'll describe in detail. And authorities are still sort of figuring out around the world how to effectively respond and to the movements of people and information and money and weapons and narcotics in a globalized world in ways that just don't match up with the systems that were developed and often the legal regimes that are in place. Anyway, so I think this is a an area that's really right out in front of a whole series of fundamental and important changes in the way the world works. And I think that the study of borders at a strategic level is just such a intellectually and academically exciting place to be. So I'm really, really thrilled to talk this through in more detail with all of you. This talk is titled "The Future of Border Management and Security is Not What It Used to Be." That title, I should explain, comes from the French poet Paul Valéry said famously that the challenge of our times is that the future is not what it used to be. And it's one that a mentor of mine, a quote that a mentor of mine has, Alan Burson, has adopted extensively when talking about these. And as we get into the slide here, the deck here, I've added a few other quotes that I think sort of share important points that we can that we'll consider sort of throughout this discussion, and as we get into some of the strategic outcomes that come from the changes that are being dealt with. So the first one is a quote from General Anthony Zinni. So he was the commander-in-chief of the United States Central Command in the 1990s. And very famously, in 2000, warned extensively about the dangers of terrorism and the rising threat from Al Qaeda. And so we have a quote from him about the underworld globalization, the challenge of security. It says that the New World Order was changing in other ways also. Globalization, I'm sorry, I've got to move my little, okay. Globalization and the explosion of information technology were making the world more independent and interconnected. Geographic obstacles such as oceans and mountain ranges no longer provided impenetrable boundaries. Economic, political, or security-related instability in remote parts of the world was having a greater effect on our, in this place he's speaking from an American, United States perspective, on our security interests and well-being in the shrinking planet. In addition, the rise of non-state entities such as non-governmental organizations, transnational criminal groups, extremist organizations, global corporations, and warlord groups brought a new and confusing dimension to a world previously dominated by nation-state interaction. The second quote that I'd like to share here to further contextualize our conversation comes from a really awful book. It's a man named Joseph Bonanno, who is famous for being in New York, the head of the Bonanno crime family. And so if you're familiar with the history of what was called the Cosa Nostra in the United States, or the American Mafia, as it's generally known, the Bonannos were sort of the least successful of the 5 New York crime families. They were the ones that were infiltrated by an FBI agent named Joseph Pistone. There was a movie made about it called Donnie Brasco. Eventually, Joseph Bonanno wrote a book about his life, which is basically unreadable. It's called A Man of Honor. And you can imagine, as this gangster presenting himself as this, sort of like medieval, almost chivalrous figure. But he makes he had this one quote from it that I think is really profound, and it's that mafia is a process and not a thing. I think when we talk a lot about transnational criminal organizations, when we talk a lot about threats as border managers, it's tempting to think of all of these entities, all these groups as these monolithic, vertically integrated organizations that need to be countered. And actually, I think what we'll see is that lots of the crime networks that exist, lots of the most challenging and dangerous threats are really sort of from flexible networks and things that evolve quickly and come together for specific purposes, and then can shift in their structure quickly. So I think that it's important to bear in mind constantly as we're talking about organized crime or threats or other things like that, that it's not what these groups are, it's what they do and how they function that we need to be focused on and need to be constantly adapting to. And the last quote I'll share is from a novelist who is a sort of a guilty favorite of mine. It's a guy named Donald Westlake, who wrote really wonderful heist novels, crime novels that center around large thefts. But he has a quote from one of his books that describes the situation in the United States in sort of the Old West. And I'll contextualize this by saying at the time, the United States did not have meaningful federal law enforcement really until the 1930s. There were certainly a number of different organizations before that, but it wasn't until sort of the FBI had been established and then further had its mandate expanded enormously that there was any kind of entity that had authority across different jurisdictions. And so throughout American history up to that point, there was always the opportunity for criminals to essentially move beyond the jurisdiction of whatever law enforcement they were dealing with and escape. And so this one, the quote is, the multinational, and it means multinational coordination, is in the position of the bank robber in the Old West. All he has to do is ride straight and hard to be safe because the posse can't cross the border. So this was very much a consistent trait throughout American history, and one that now we're seeing in a very different way, where criminals are able to arbitrage different regulatory regimes in different places and use that to escape sort of the traditional law enforcement responses that exist. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got here, what the previous regime in terms of the way borders were understood and managed looks like, and then how this has been increasingly challenged as there have been a number of technological and societal shifts around the world that have changed the way people interact with borders and made a lot of the old processes either redundant or just less effective. So to start, I guess at the beginning, we'd say the modern regime of border management, the current understanding of borders really was really established for the first time in the Peace of Westphalia, which occurred at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. And what this really institutionalized, what this really put in place was a series of principles that first, states were entirely sovereign within their own territory. And this sounds like such a basic thing for all of us now, because of course states are sovereign within their territory. But up until this time, that wasn't necessarily the case. This war in particular involved these sort of trans-state entities like the Spanish Empire, which extended from Spain through Austria and into what we now think of as Belgium and the Netherlands, and was also very much fought along religious lines, and the principle that one state is not able to intervene in the affairs of another, absent that being seen as a hostile act, sort of a declaration of war, didn't fully exist up until this point. And so related to that was the principle that states are entirely responsible and able to manage their borders and the movement of people or goods into and out of the state independently. And this is something, again, that was not necessarily consistent across different kinds of political entities, particularly in Europe and in other places in the world before this point. But the modern state system was really established at this point and became the basis for the way that countries interact through the present. These principles and these ideas of independent states, of the state being the foundation of all international relations, and non-intervention absent really extreme situations, or unless without it being interpreted as an act of extreme hostility, really all come back to the end of the 30 Years' War and then the order that was established after that. So while things have evolved significantly, of course, in the centuries since, we're still largely in that world. There are some There are certainly organizations that are transnational that look to do things like manage flows of people seeking humanitarian protections, like the UN High Commissioner on Refugees or the International Organization on Migration. There are certainly coordinating bodies for international law enforcement, things like Interpol. But fundamentally, the key institutions, the key actors remain at the state level. And even the key transnational organizations like the United Nations are fundamentally places where states get together to hash things out among each other as at least legally equals. And all of that comes from this structure that was created. And so I'm going to talk through now how that structure, the way that a series of independent states managing their borders separately have been challenged. And so the first thing I'd like to talk about are the growth of international maritime shipping routes. And so this is a visualization I think is actually particularly is interesting, but it's also sort of beautiful, that shows the paths of ships to the paths of ships around international sea lanes. And you can sort of see here what you can see the land represented in this map by basically what is dark. And so, of course, this is the Caribbean Sea. This is this is Mexico, and then I'm pointing, which is not useful because none of you can see where I'm pointing. But you can see this is the Western Hemisphere, in the Central America, Mexico, Southern United States, and then here is a global version of the map where you can see how the brighter spots are where ships converge and have to go through narrower spaces, and containerized shipping is something that really only became widespread in the 1960s. Up until that point, ships were almost entirely what they call break bulk, where you'd have a large ship, you'd figure out what you needed to put in, and you would have a lot of burly men go and put the things into the ship however they could fit them. And then when you needed to unload the ship, you went through a similar process where everything was unloaded piece by piece. Inevitably, there were sort of large amounts of theft, and the docks were sort of famously rough and tumble places. And then in the 1960s, standardized cargo containers, which we're all very, very familiar with, were introduced by a company called Sealand, which was developed by a U.S. trucking executive who sort of one of underappreciated visionaries who created the 20-foot and then the 40-foot cargo container. And then the result of this was that many of the existing port cities resisted the new type of cargo containers and the new sort of organization that came with it, and were then replaced by ports nearby. And so this is why some of the very famous ports, historical ports, are no longer places where cargo arrives, but there'll be places nearby. So in the United States, the port of New York City, Manhattan used to be a place where things were unloaded, and all of that switched to Newark because the entrenched interests in Manhattan didn't want to switch to cargo containers. Similar thing happened in San Francisco, where all the cargo is now in Oakland, across the bay. And so as cargo containers have made shipping much more efficient, the volumes have become absolutely astronomical. And then particularly also as the growth of manufacturing in the Chinese economy, and these series of giant ports within China have sort of grown to ascendance in the world stage. In 2021, the UN measured 11 billion tons of worldwide container cargo moved through these shipping lanes. So it really is an absolutely extraordinary amount of stuff that moves around, and it affects all of us. There's a book by English journalist named Rose George called 90% of Everything that talks about how 90% of everything that you interact with in daily life was was on a ship in a cargo container and went through these processes. And so the next major shift that I'd like to talk about is with air travel and also air cargo. So according to the United States Department of Transportation, there are 87,000 flights over U.S. airspace every day. There's some statistics here about the number of people traveling, but I think that the main ones are that the numbers of international air travelers globally are now consistently in several billion people a year, and tens of millions of flights a year. And so people are now able to move around the world much, much faster than historically was ever even remotely possible. And I think we'll talk about this more a little bit later, but people who are intending to migrate and move among countries are able to go from their home countries to transit countries to destination countries at speeds that were just unimaginable previously. And the result is that the way routes have shifted or changed, and the way people are presenting themselves for humanitarian protections, seeking asylum and other things like that, has dramatically shifted from times when migrants, refugees were slow moving groups of people either on foot or through other vehicles that were moving in predictable patterns, staying in camps for long periods of time, and eventually making their way to destination countries. All of that is changing very fundamentally as people are able to move around, and at the same time other kinds of people who are potentially dangerous, whether people who have connections to organized crime or terrorism or things, are able to move around the world in ways that are extremely challenging for authorities to track, just because of the speed at which someone can go from country to country. So the next shift here, sorry, it clicks when there we don't do it right, is about I'm using this as a proxy for communication around the world. And so this is the growth of global WhatsApp users. I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with this, but the number of people who have this one communication app is now well into several billion. And this change in the way people are able to instantaneously communicate and on devices that they carry with them all the time is underappreciated, even in the last the changes that have occurred over the last decade and a half compared to the decade before and before then. And I want to emphasize how the ability of people to move information, make calls, share files and pictures and things essentially for free has made a lot of the traditional ways that authorities manage the movement of borders or communications in and out of their countries sort of irrelevant. In the past, there are famous stories of national authorities monitoring mail, and opening suspicious envelopes, things like that, or people being able to, or sort of traditionally even then tapping telephone lines, or the things like this, where authorities were able to track fairly well how communication was happening internationally. And now the volume is so extreme, and the volume of encrypted communications is at such a high level that it's far beyond the ability of any national authority to attempt to control. And so the next example of globalized flows and the changes that I'll describe here are in the international flows of narcotics. And so, narcotics are one of the larger commodities in the world. The precise numbers and value are, for obvious reasons, challenging to do more than estimate about, but the flows are distinctly international in a similar way to the movement of like petroleum products around the world. There are now quite developed institutions to produce, refine, transport, distribute narcotics, and then to recycle the proceeds from this back into the illegal financial system to move them all around the world. And so this is a visualization of some of the largest types of the largest flows of narcotics around the world. And so you can see that opiates, traditional opiates from poppies, are largely grown in three places. One is Central Asia, another one is Southeast Asia, and then through South America, and then to some extent into Mexico. And then are moved from there really around the world, but particularly to the largest narcotics markets in the world, which are Europe and the United States. And then coca, the plant that from which cocaine is produced, is really only grown in the Andes region of South America, so places like Colombia, Bolivia, Peru. And though from there also how cocaine is refined largely in the region and then distributed around the world, major markets, and increasingly now synthetic products, the most notorious of which I think is fentanyl, are able to be moved very, very quickly, many originating in China or India, to other countries, often where they're turned into pill form or farther produced, and then from there taken to the countries that that provide the primary drug markets. And so these flows, these are fundamentally transnational industries that move drugs very, very quickly around the world, and which have very consistently overwhelmed the ability of national authorities to control for a long time, but particularly in the time since the United States began the war on drugs, which began in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and the narcotics markets expanded very, very dramatically. And the last visualization I'll show to describe further these shifts is of this map, which comes from a book called Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization, by an author named Parag Khanna, which shows a series of different types of infrastructure that connects across national borders. And what is interesting, I think, particularly about this, and this, of course, shows us how this works throughout Asia, but particularly things like the movement of gas pipelines, railroads, oil pipelines, all fundamentally transnational infrastructure that is moving products, moving goods, and moving people and cargo throughout regions. And as this has become more entrenched, and as this has expanded, again, this question, which used to be quite a simple one for national authorities, of, well, how do you appropriately tax all of the goods that enter your country, become more complicated as we're talking about things like flows of gas, or as we're talking about goods that maybe have been originate in one place and have been worked on in several other countries and are partially finished and go through final finishing, or all of these different extremely complex networks that now exist in these distributed production processes that make it much, much more complicated for national authorities to be able to answer fairly, what used to be very straightforward questions about exactly how many of some kind of thing entered the country and how much those were worth. And same thing with the movement of people, where traditionally how many people entered the country becomes a lot more complicated when you've got large numbers of people who are transiting airports on their ways to other countries, or people who are being pre-cleared by customs or migration authorities in one country before they arrive in another country, and what exactly their status is and how all that works when you're thinking about traditional ways of approaching borders. So those are those are some of the changes, the shifts, the societal and technological trends that have made it much more challenging for authorities to use traditional mechanisms and to use sort of the traditional legal mechanisms to respond to what are now globalized flows of people, goods, and information. So to sort of summarize what that means here, as borders have traditionally been lines on a map, places where you sort of waited to see what would arrive and then responded to it and determined, is this someone, or are these goods that can enter? Are they authorized? What do I do? Do I tax them? Is this person dangerous? All of that happened after something was presented at a border. Now they're very much transnational flows that have to be managed as such, and have to be understood as continuous movements where border authorities can't just focus on the specific lines where people or goods are moving from country to country, but have to look at them from where they begin to where they end. And this is important, incredibly important, both from a security perspective, because if you're only going to try and intercept something dangerous at one point, right when it moves between two nations, and that point is a port of entry, which are by definition incredibly congested and backed up and under enormous time pressure, you're largely going to be unsuccessful. It's very, very difficult to take the time that you would need to determine if someone is potentially dangerous, or if they have connections to criminal groups or terrorism or other things, or to thoroughly search cargo. And at the same time, an approach that's based on that's based on just focusing on the line itself, also creates major backups and has major economic impacts. You know, if you are going to try to do 100% searches of vehicles or people crossing the border, very quickly there will be enormous lines, there will be major economic impacts, and all of the benefits of the changes that we've described will be limited. And so the response to that, what border authorities, and I'm sure all of you around the world are involved in, is figuring out, well, how do we manage borders as flows? How do we interact with borders that are open and porous 24/7, 365 days a year, where people and information and goods are constantly moving, and where there are by definition constant change as that is outside the control of regulators. And so and so the key points about the new paradigm and the way that authorities are approaching this are that they are moving from this traditional focus on the line itself to the entire path that goods and people take. And the keys to that are through advanced information, through transnational partnerships across different countries, and across multiple countries in many situations, and through risk segmentation, where that advanced information about people is applied against complex analytical tools in order to figure out what presents the highest level of risk, what presents less risk, and about what more information is needed in order to focus the resources of authorities and law enforcement where it is most needed, and to provide the least possible friction for everyone else, so that the people who want to communicate, want to move money, want to travel, want to move goods legally, face as little delay as possible. But people who are potentially dangerous or other things present threats, are responded to very quickly. And so I think you'll be able. Professor Brunicelli, let me know. I think there are videos attached to this, certainly for the Christmas Day bomber, the underwear bomber, and I think potentially also the Yemen cargo plot. So I don't know that I'll go into a ton of detail about these, but they were sort of seminal cases in the United States that showed the importance of this. The basics of this were that there were, within a period of a year in the United States, there were 2 attempted terrorist attacks. One from a passenger who carried a bomb on his person, and another one where a group had attempted to send, or had sent, bombs hidden in printer cartridges. And in both of these situations, the bombs were actually on passenger airplanes before they were able to be identified and before they were able to be neutralized. And in the Christmas Day case, it was only stopped because of other passengers on the plane. You'll see the young man who had carried the bomb attempted to ignite it, burned himself. Other passengers intervened, and it never went off. But if it had, it would have taken down a full civilian airliner over a major American city, over Detroit, on, I believe, Christmas Day. And then for the second case, there were bombs hidden in, as I said, that printer cartridges. They were carried in the belly cargo of a passenger plane at one point, and were identified because they'd originated in Yemen. Saudi intelligence had communicated through the UK to the United States and alerted authorities of this. But in both cases, it became very clear that the existing systems, which were pretty good at looking at advanced information and identifying when something dangerous was entering the United States so that United States authorities could respond to it, were inadequate for a threat that was carried on a passenger airplane headed towards the United States. And in each case, the systems had to be quickly redesigned. And the first one, the Christmas Day bomber, the young man, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, had actually been identified by United States Customs and Border Protection as someone who was potentially dangerous and needed to be sent to secondary inspection after he arrived. That's obviously inadequate when a person was already on a passenger airplane over the United States carrying a bomb on his body. Similarly, with the Yemen cargo plot, these were printers that originated in Yemen. They'd been sent to a synagogue in Chicago. It was obviously a pretty unusual transaction, and one that had, I believe, been flagged for when it arrived. It would have been something that where the cargo would have been screened carefully after it arrived in the United States before it was sent on through the postal system. But that is also totally inadequate for a threat where bombs could have gone off in passenger airplanes. And so in each of these situations, authorities had to come up with new ways to deal with it. And so in the case of passengers, for the first one, there were a series of international partnerships that were put in place with much more aggressive information sharing. There were processes by which passengers could be denied boarding much earlier if they had even a series of suspicious patterns. And in this case, the young man had bought a plane ticket in cash. It was a flight across multiple continents where he had no luggage. I mean, there were a series of things that were pretty clearly suspicious. And so those rules that would identify someone like that have now been put in place. And in terms of air cargo, there's a partnership. It's called a Air Cargo Advanced Screening that was established with the carriers of air cargo in order to provide much more advanced information that previously been connected for logistical reasons to United States authorities in order to allow them to match that against potential threats and then communicate it quickly back to the carriers so that they didn't end up in situations where dangerous goods were moving around on planes in the belly cargo. When we say belly cargo, right? We're talking about it's on a plane that is filled with passengers and there's cargo underneath them. Potentially really awful situations where people are being endangered. So the whole way that passengers and air cargo were responded to had to be shifted pretty dramatically after both of these two incidents. And I think I think you'll want to enjoy the videos because they're interesting stories, but they really exemplify how even in the United States after 9/11, where there was a huge push for improved security screening, there were almost unlimited resources pushed into counterterrorism. There were still major gaps that weren't found until a threat presented itself, and where these flows of people, goods around the world created vulnerabilities that only were identified after they'd been exploited, and how that continues to be a struggle for authorities around the world as flows of goods and people and information shift. So as we talk about the way, as we think about how an effective response to these kinds of threats looks, one of the important principles and one of the ways that authorities have been able to effectively respond is by understanding that whether you call it homeland security, whether you call it national security, interior defense, whatever term different countries use, that these are fundamentally transnational, and you can't effectively protect any country from the range of threats that we're talking about without having transnational partnerships and also a mix of public-private partnerships where you're working with the entities that are moving people and goods and information among different countries. And one of the key principles to this is to push borders out in time and space. And so this sounds a little it sounds a little bit like I'm making things up, right? How do you push borders out in times and space? But you do it by using advanced information. You do it by using partnerships to intervene as early as is possible in a journey, and to use whichever authority is able to act in order to neutralize a threat before it arrives in the jurisdiction that you're responsible for the safety of. And I think that the second part, using whichever entity is best positioned to react, is a real paradigm shift for a lot of law enforcement, particularly for investigators. I think there is always a tendency to want to keep information with themselves, largely because it allows them to build cases and to be able to potentially arrest and prosecute, and larger cases tend to get more attention and are certainly better for folks' careers. But in terms of border security, in terms of managing the response to international threats now, that approach isn't adequate. The more you keep information to yourself and avoid sharing it, and then wait until things have arrived in whichever jurisdiction you're in, and then try to respond, the less of a margin for error you have. You have to do it exactly right. And I think what we're seeing now is that it's much more effective to use whatever entity is best positioned initially and keep those dangerous goods or people out of the supply chains, out of the international flows of people, rather than letting them get in at all. And this can be challenging. Often national authorities have long histories together. They have good reasons where they might not want to share information with each other. There are often things that there are differences in approaches that people potentially object to. I mean, the United States and Canada have certainly had some profound disagreements about the way that the United States has treated terrorism suspects, and particularly Canadian citizens, in some cases dual nationals, and that has been led to some very I think well-founded reasons for people being concerned about sharing information and wanting to provide advanced information about potentially dangerous people or other things. But largely, as partnerships have been able to grow and as countries have been able to work together, we've seen that the most effective regimes are ones where countries are able to partner and just allow whoever is the authority for different steps in these processes or supply chains to respond. And so this is quite a change from the traditional nation by nation approach, that what we call the Westphalian approach. But we're seeing it's increasingly that's an artifact of history, and that's something that is not adequate to deal with the kinds of shifts that we're talking about here. And the other essential point I want to emphasize about this is that this kind of approach, where borders are pushed out, where you use advanced information, where you use we use analytics, we use international partnerships, then we use segmentation of risk, is not in conflict with creates a situation where expediting legal commerce, expediting legal travel are not in conflict with security, but are in fact two sides of the same process. And so in the traditional system of border management, where it's done country by country and there's a focus on the actual line of the border, the idea of facilitating trade or facilitating travel is always in tension with higher levels of security. And you basically, the way authorities have traditionally thought of it is sort of a balance where you say, well, I want this much security, and I'm only willing to tolerate this level of disruption to flows of goods. And you sort of, well, I guess we'll have a little less security. People are complaining about the lines in the border, they're complaining about this, and you sort of balance it out. But if instead you can look at borders as flows and look at securing the entire path of goods or people moving among countries, it can actually be complementary. And one of the ways in which that's done are through what we call trusted trader or trusted traveler programs. I'm sure many of you are familiar with programs like Global Entry in the United States, Nexus in Canada, where people are able to provide advanced information to authorities, and in return are processed in an expedited way at airports or at the land border. And these programs, one, have a benefit for travelers because they don't have to wait in lines that are as long. They're able to move much faster. So people love them. I used to, when I worked at Customs and Border Protection in the United States, you used to say that was like the one thing, Global Entry was the one thing everyone liked about CBP. Most of the other stuff people talked about publicly were negative, or things that people, had concerns about. But this was always the thing that everyone thought of in a positive way. But for authorities, it's also, it has a significant security benefit, and the one that's often overlooked, and that's that that border authorities don't have to spend a bunch of time going over the passports and asking questions for people who are very, very likely to be safe and who are willing to submit to background investigations in advance. And those are the people who we want to spend the least amount of time on. I mean, all of you know the traveler who goes back and forth weekly between two countries, who has who has no criminal connections, who is get involved in entirely legitimate travel, is the last person that authorities should be spending long periods of time questioning. They want to be focused on people who potentially present some kind of danger. And the same thing on the trade side. There are a series of programs around the world. They're generally called AEO programs, Authorized Economic Operator. In the United States, it's got a pretty clumsy acronym. It's called CTPAT, which stands for Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. But there's a series of programs where companies can self-certify their supply chains and then have random inspections where they allow authorities to come check all their processes, determine that their factories and transit nodes are secure, and in response be processed much more quickly at the borders. I mean, there's also there are programs in places like in the United States and the land borders where trucks, where the drivers have also been vetted, can cross more quickly. And these programs are a way to both speed the movement of legitimate trade and allow a cargo that is very low risk to quickly be processed in between countries, but at the same time to free up resources for people for goods and cargo who deserve much more attention. And this is something that has really provided enormous both facilitation and security benefits at the borders where it's been applied. So the sort of logic behind this is that if you're looking for a needle in a haystack, which is what all of us do, right? If you're involved in trying to find someone who presents a threat among the millions of travelers who are moving through legitimate processes, or the one cargo container in a giant port that has narcotics hidden in it, there are a couple different ways to do it. The first, and I'm using this analogy of a haystack and a needle, the first is to go through and search everything in it, to spend all the time to take every piece of hay out and try and find it, and do that laboriously, which is, the counterparts to the analogy is the same as if we tried to search every single person who attempted to move across the border in detail and answer extensive questions and spend lots of time with each of them. The problem with that is it's incredibly labor intensive and has a disastrous effect on trade and travel. The next way to respond is to try and use intelligence to know exactly where the needle will be in the haystack and only go into one spot and get it. And that works. That is effective and does not have a facilitation. It does not create facilitation problems. But the challenge with that is that you need good intelligence to do that. And while authorities often have access to good intelligence about threats that are moving through legitimate trade and travel networks, they sometimes don't. And it's the situations where they don't that they need alternatives. And then so the last way that you can respond to this is to actually try and reduce the size of the haystack. And so that's where trusted traveler and trusted trader programs are so essential, because if you're able to make the haystack 80% smaller, because you're able to say, all right, well, all of these entities have been pre-vetted and we've gone through and we're able to remove them from what we need to pay attention on, then your efforts to search are going to be much more effective, and you're going to be able to find, you're much more likely to be able to find what you're looking for. The other essential piece of this is the effective exploitation of advanced data. And so, all governments always have gathered fairly large amounts of information about what's coming in. I think we're very familiar with customs declarations and everything, and they want to do that for good reason. They're interested in who's arriving, and they they want to, countries have always wanted to apply customs for revenue purposes, but now that countries are able to gather much more information in advance, it's opening up whole new avenues of analytics where authorities are able to do things like establish rules that can identify suspicious behavior patterns or suspicious connections among different entities in ways that were much harder to do before. And so that can be used in situations like with the example of the underwear bomber, this person who boarded a plane, paid for ticket and cash, asked to sit above the wing, which is where the fuel tank is located, and did not have any baggage on a transcontinental flight. I mean, there's a series of things like that where you can say, all right, well, these would trigger some kind of additional attention, but they can also become much more subtle. It can be things where, well, wait a minute, this is a adult male who arrived at a certain airport with a young woman who he said was his niece, and then at some other period, some period shortly after, arrived with another young woman who he also said was his niece. Things like that in an individual instance may or may not be suspicious, but when you start to aggregate them, can become the kinds of things that are extremely telling, or things that are even more subtle than that. Connections among people, other things that can indicate criminal activity or other kinds of potential threats, or even just things where someone deserves more attention. And I think this is actually even more promising and even more important on the side of cargo, where the connections among companies can be very easily obscured intentionally. And so where things like common addresses or certain individuals with connections across different entities that can indicate that companies may be connected with other entities that have been involved in criminal activity or presented other kinds of threats become incredibly important. Because otherwise, being shown a new company that was established in a place with a secrecy regime that does not allow you to even see beneficial ownership. A lot of these things can be very, very hard for authorities to respond to. But if you're able to make these kinds of connections using complex analytics that enable you to see these connections in ways that you could never have a person just try and find on their own, it becomes much, much more effective. And the next step in all of this, and the one that I would encourage all of you to think about, is how this becomes done transnationally, because largely a lot of these advances have been done either country by country or done within the structures of corporations that are doing this for their own security and compliance reasons. But thinking about how this looks as countries are partnering, how they can do this where they can look across multiple data sets while still protecting things that they're required to protect, but enabling their border authorities to make these kind of connections where they need to, and to be able to find things that really do deserve the additional attention at the border is essential, and something that is not solved yet, but is something that I think it's people like the folks in this discussion who will be figuring out how we address that, and how we make the kinds of partnerships or transnational networks or institutions that can allow data from multiple places to be queried at once while still being appropriately protected for privacy purposes. And so to sort of summarize what some of the key principles from this point that information is power, but that you grow the power of the information you have by sharing with it instead of hoarding it, is an essential paradigm shift, and one that often law enforcement is resistant to, but one that I think will ring true with all of you, and one that has to sort of continue to be established across different governments around the world and across different government entities that are involved in border security. Before in the United States, there was a major transition on this, but it was really only in one area. It was in the area of information about terrorism, where before the 9/11 attacks in 2001, the people who worked at places like the FBI or the CIA were most worried about what would happen to them if they shared information and then it ended up having been inappropriate. There was always what's called a need to know regime, where it said, well, did you share information with this person? Like, maybe I know that there's someone potentially dangerous who's arrived in the United States, and maybe they're taking flying lessons, and maybe they're living with someone else who's potentially dangerous, and they're receiving money transfers from the United Arab Emirates, and there's a whole series of things that might be suspicious. But if I go and I share that with a local police officer, and then later someone determines that that person didn't need to know, that could be a career-ending problem for me. I shared secret information with the wrong person. And so after 9/11, that changed in the United States in a terrorism context, where instead of being need to know, it became need to share. And after that, instead of worrying, well, what if I share this information and I shouldn't have, everyone became worried, what if I have something in one of my files that could stop an attack and I didn't share it? That's how my career is going to end. And so that was an incredibly important change, and it's one that's been really effective. The limitation has been that was mostly just related to terrorism data. So in the United States, I would say we still have not come up with that kind of model for organized crime in the same way, where there's still particularly among investigative agencies, a reluctance to share information with other entities because they want to preserve cases. So an organized crime figure who's entering the United States, that may not be known to a border authority because someone at, say, the DEA or something may have a long-term investigation that they want to preserve. So there still is that kind of tension. And I'm sure for many of you in your organizations, you see this as well. And it's one that I think needs to be continued to be overcome in order to make this kind of approach to borders as flows more effective. And the other key point is that privacy and analytics and big data are things that don't have to be in conflict. And I think that I'm talking a lot about examples from the United States because because I worked in the United States government, I'm most familiar with it. There was a time when the response to, whenever people talked about information sharing, basically meant, okay, you're going to give us all your data, right? So if I'm from the FBI and I want to partner with Customs and Border Protection, information sharing meant they had to give me everything they had, right? And you just give me all your data, and then I'd put it in our database and I'd analyze all of it, and that would be that. It would be great. And that increasingly created problems as different organizations had different kinds of rules and different kinds of privacy protections they needed to adhere to. It was particularly a problem between intelligence agencies, which had certain authorities, and law enforcement, which operated under a different set of rules. And the way that that's been dealt with most effectively is by having federated searches where you can have multiple databases where the search can go in and look for something very specific, but it only comes back if it's got a direct hit, and where there can be some kind of control on how that information is shared. And those kind of processes have enabled much more robust information sharing than was ever really possible before. And so I think those kinds of approaches and those kind of protections are going to be necessary because, as all of you know, especially country to country, if you go to a partner and say, hey, yeah, we've got a great idea, information sharing is important, everyone agrees on that, why don't you just give me all of the information you have, and I'll ingest it, and I'll do this bulk data transfer, and I'll analyze things, and it'll be wonderful. We'll find all kinds of stuff. People are often just unable to do that, but also would be very reluctant to. But if you can have processes where searches are federated, where information remains in multiple databases, but the tools can go through and find just what they're specifically looking for and bring that back out, you can really overcome a lot of these traditional challenges. So that's the bulk of what I wanted to talk about here. I think I'll just to summarize. I think I want to emphasize that the new paradigm of the way borders are managed focuses on them as flows and not just as jurisdictional lines, and that there are a series of tools that are being developed to deal with that, but are still not fully developed. And all of you will be important in that process. And your creativity and your experience in applying all this will really be how these things get to the next level. But things like risk segmentation, using trusted traveler and trusted shipper programs, the use of advanced information, understanding that borders are fundamentally transnational, and then understanding that there is a paradigm where sharing information makes you more powerful, and what you have, being able to apply it to these kinds of potential threats is what organizationally will push you forward. And that there are tools that are being developed and can be applied, like federated searches, that allow for these kinds of searches to be done in a privacy compliant way. All of these are important steps that are moving towards the kinds of transnational border management that is appropriate for transnational globalized movements of people, goods, contraband, money, and information. And this is only going to continue, and we're only going to need more and more sophisticated and creative approaches along these lines. So with that, I've been talking a lot. I will stop for a second. We have some practicum slides. I think we'll break out and allow all of you to talk about these kind of ideas with some specific examples. And there have been some questions about each one, but I would encourage you to really try and apply some of these ideas across these. But I think I should break for a second, Professor, see if there's anything that you wanted to talk about in more detail, or anything you wanted to focus on, or I'm happy to take questions or take this in whichever direction is most useful for the group.
Yeah, so absolutely. Any questions or comments, it's a good time to formulate them. Getahun, do you want to unmute and speak up and raise your comment, or I can also read it for you, but if you want to add to it, you should not hesitate. Getahun says to us, it is clear now that international borders are going far from business as usual, diminishing due to globalization, technological advancement, and free flows of information, people, and goods, with many unknown actors. How should we assess ignored instabilities in other parts of the world? I guess that's the fundamental question that Getahun is raising. Getahun, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, just Mr. Emmanuel, thank you very much.
Please.
Yeah, because these areas may impact the other parts of the world. For instance, they may be a threat for global trade routes when they are growing and get larger. They may be also a fertile ground for terrorism and many other problems. It may seem not impacting the other parts of the world, but it's all our problem. That's why I raised this question, sir. Please see it in that perspective. Thank you.
No, thank you. It's a great question. I think what I would suggest is that there will always be instability in different places, and it'll always be unpredictable, right? It'll be something where that there are places that can be incredibly stable for a long amount of time, and then suddenly things change. One example I deal with a lot personally is I do a lot of case management and work to help get families to self-sustainable situations in the United States who have migrated from Venezuela. And 25 years ago, that was one of the last places in anywhere in Central or South America that people were migrating to the United States from. And the situation has changed dramatically. But in terms of thinking about potential threats and how to get ahead of them and how to respond to instability, I think the important shift in thinking about these is that it's not just about, okay, there's instability in some other place in the world. What happens if that arrives in my country? It's, okay, there's instability and then maybe there are potentially dangerous people or there's some group or there's something happening. How do we keep them out of the international travel system, or how do we keep these dangerous people from exploiting international trade systems? So, I'll use it in the United States context. If you say like there are terrorists in some specific place, it's not how do we keep, what does that mean for the United States, right? And that's, I think, traditionally been the way authorities thought about this. How do we keep these people out of the United States? And the point is not that someone is trying to come to the United States. The point is, can terrorists exploit the international travel system at all? Because if they do it anywhere, that's a problem because people move so quickly. So, are we keeping terrorist networks out of international trade system? And again, anywhere in the world is a problem because there are so few, it's so consolidated, and there's such a specific number of giant ports where things are all pushed together that just having access even to parts of the system can potentially be dangerous. And so I would say that the way I would suggest authorities thinking about it is not just, all right, what does this mean at my border and how do I think about travelers or groups from some other country, but how do I work with partners to make sure that this whole system can't be exploited by dangerous people or groups? It's a larger challenge, but is, I think, very much the direction that authorities need to go, and one that we're starting to move towards, but are not fully there yet.
Okay, very good. Faith, Matenge, thank you so much, Faith, for your long question. I'm going to read it, but if you want to take the floor, you can unmute. And as soon as I've read it, you can take the floor and add to it. The UN ODC supported initiative on Joint Port Control Unit has been very successful at the seaport of Mombasa, Kenya. Partner government agencies work closely with each other to be able to fight transnational crime. An impressive example is where the Kenya Wildlife Service alerts the GPU, the Joint Port Control Unit, in case of a poaching incident. For the team of the seaport to be on the lookout for ivory export. I can only imagine the greater benefits if such initiatives can be escalated from national to transnational information sharing and cooperation. I think the starting point is trust, followed by goodwill of the law enforcers to cooperate transnationally. Thank you very much, Ben, for this insight. Faith, do you want to add to this?
Not at all. I think you have read it out well. Thank you.
Ben, do you want to reply to this?
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Faith, for sharing that. I think it's a laudable, it's an excellent initiative, but also I think is exactly the kind of adaptation to these new challenges that I was trying to talk about here. I mean, I think that these processes aren't easy, and I think you're highlighting the importance of trust between different partners is really essential, and it's something where these structures, from what I've seen, often initially are built sort of on a person-to-person trust basis, where it's like, well, this is someone I've worked with a lot. They, have treated me well in the past. Okay, we'll establish some information sharing. And then after that sort of key person relationship gets a process started, then it can build on its own. And then you end up with lots of people from two different organizations or multiple organizations working together, and you can really put systems in place. But I think it's absolutely right. Often, in order to get, and I don't know that it should be like this. You would hope that it could be just more like, all right, these two institutions have important roles and they're going to be forced to figure it out. But I think you're exactly right. The way it actually works is that there will be someone, they'll have a key relationship, they'll build up a lot of trust, they'll establish a program, and then eventually it's done at the organizational level after that. And you can have those kinds of partnerships. But yeah, no, I think that's really insightful and an important part of this.
Thank you so much. So one comment that I have about the lecture that we've just had and how it relates to, the past lectures of this week and the ones that you could attend in the future is on that very issue of trust. In the Border Security Institute, we actually have studied trust as a mechanism through which security agencies can work together. And there is here a really interesting conundrum, because for the longest time, when you look at the academic literature on trust, what you discover is that people assume you have to have some cultural common point. In the literature in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, trust was understood as something that would emerge out of culture, common culture. And in the Anglophone world, out of, it's just because I'm going to be quite critical of it, in the Anglophone world, people assume that if you were not born Anglophone, you could not be trusted. So you had, and you were limited to create partnerships within the Anglophone world. And so other security agencies that were not Anglophone would not work. If you are interested in this work, I can point to you to major international relations scholars who worked on this and published books on this in the 1950s. Well, what we discovered, we did two books on the topic. We did one book where we look at basically how trusting, how security agencies trust each other on the different continents. So we have a book where we have chapters where we look at Latin America, North America, Europe, Africa, the rest of the world, Asia. And we have developed a model. And then we did the same on the Canada-US border, where we look at all of the border regions. We look at Cascadia, we look at, the prairie. We have two case studies on the prairies. We have one on the Great Lakes. We have one on the Atlantic. We have a case study also on the Arctic, and then we've got the Pacific. And what we discovered, and then we compare this systematically, obviously, in the way we frame the whole North American case, we compare this with the way, in a way, trust has been developed and implemented in the EU, inside the European Union. Why do we do this? Because in North America, across the Canada-US border, you've got that major argument that you can only trust Canada-US officials because they were born and they speak English as their main language. So it's the same culture. And it's not really controversial. The culture variation is quite small. But how did the Europeans do this across 27 nations with 20 official languages and a history of war, which is quite recent and continues? And what we discover is that once organizations are interested in developing process and develop process that are respected, then trust can be operationalized inside their bureaucracies. And then process, because it's reciprocal, you agree on a process where A does A and B does B, and then you start relying on each other and you build together multiple processes, and then progressively it implemented and works out extremely well. And then we create a kind of a typology of levels of trust that we call coordination, cooperation and collaboration, and we published the book last fall. And one of the things that I really like about this is that theoretically, trust was already understood in the 1970s by a Nobel Prize winner who was a political economist, Eleanor Ostrom, where she published a book on this, which is called, listen carefully, the two words, trust and reciprocity. And the secret in trust is the reciprocity in the process. So once you can establish a process with reciprocity, you establish trust as a bureaucratic mechanism. You can do this across bureaucracies within the same state or across states, as demonstrated by our research, but also by what has happened in Europe, which I think, Ben, I'm so glad that we had the question, but I'm also happy that you bring us there, because the other thing I want to say is that what Ben has really shed the light on is the necessary partnership across states. Remember how he started his research? The presentation starts by the states are still the prime actors, which is something that we keep on coming back to. But now what he's telling us is that states cannot implement true security if they don't partner with each other, because of so much global flows, basically, or global movement across the world. They have to work with each other, and they have to learn to trust and share data more and more. We're at the beginning of that process, right? In a way, we're not really at the beginning, but I would say in terms of a generation of the life of a human being, we are still at the beginning. We are talking, we discovered these ideas maybe 5, 7, since 9/11, a lot of thinking have been put into this, so we could extend this to about 10, 11 years. But basically, the idea is fairly recent, right? And so when we do research on data sharing inside the World Customs Organization, I already mentioned this very briefly in class, but we go a survey of 85 different countries, and what do we discover? They do not collect, publish, or even use the information that they have in the same manner, so they can't actually share the data. And so the World Customs now organization has a committee that is trying to create some common standards in statistic and collection of statistics across the world, right? So that's in a way a mechanism by which you can create trust. But this, when Ben tells us the states are at the beginning of this, they really, more and more today, we have to develop this kind of partnerships across the world to work together. Now, think about what you learned during the whole week. At the local level, it's the same. It's only that and this is why we introduce slowly in the class, we talk a lot about local level partnerships, which basically drive the cross-border peace and management process, right? You cannot manage a cross-border issue from a state level. You cannot do a good job if you are, multi-state level. It's very, very difficult. We see that at the European level. But this is the big breakthrough, right? It's this idea that both at the local, regional, sub-regional, and national, international levels, you have to develop these mechanisms of trust. And I think that's the big lesson in, across the 5 days, in a way, workshop that you have had, is that whether you like it or not, your organization can be at the top of, I would say, what we know today in terms of cross-border processes and cross-border management, if it works towards creating these alliances that allow for the development of trust mechanisms across different administrative procedures. That applies to customs fleet, and it applies to immigration, because as soon as you want to pre-clear, for instance, as soon as you want to work ahead of a movement or a flow, you actually have to have standardized organization, standardized collection of data, and you have to be able to work well ahead, I guess, of the movement. So that idea that you work well ahead of the movement really puts you in that situation where, trust from a bureaucratic perspective is absolutely fundamental. So there are still lots of countries, and I kind of laughing at this because I'm thinking in the modern world, supposedly modern world, right? I tend to agglomerate basically the Europe and North America. We have so many problems with regard to trust. Between Canada and the US, we have the illusion that we're really close, but we are so, sometimes in some processes, we're so far. And Ben actually pointed to some issues with regard to, human rights and arrest and all the procedures that have, treatment of Canadian citizens by US agencies and so on and so forth. I don't want to go in those details, but there are real cases that are preempting these mechanisms from appearing. And I'll just point to one. When I started looking at the integrated border enforcement processes, the integrated border enforcement teams that were created post 9/11 between Canada and the US, I did a lot of interview work. And the stumbling block between US and Canadian officials was the interpretation of the Charter of Human Rights. Both countries has one. And they could not agree what it meant on the ground. And to this day, we're still stumbling on this. So this is kind of the limit, right? It's that we can touch from the finger. You have a sense that interpretation of rule of law sometimes, even when aligned, remains a major issue. Okay, but I don't want to speak too much because I've already
No. I do. I want to say that what you said really resonated with me because I used to do quite a bit of work with the government of Mexico. And so, you would think that the United States and Mexico, I mean, while our history is let us say complicated, are very important partners, right? It's in their, the governments of Mexico, they've got high level mechanisms. The government of Mexico and the United States have high level mechanisms to interact. But what I found when I started working on these is that actually, so the United States has vastly more developed multilateral mechanisms to work with other Anglophone countries, and particularly the Five Eyes, the famous the United States, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, where there are all kinds of different levels of meetings that happen, where there'll be the heads of the intelligence agencies, the heads of migration agencies, heads of the customs agencies, all these other things. And there was nothing like that in place with Mexico. And the first, which is crazy, because Mexico is often the United States' large. I mean, either Mexico or Canada tend to be our largest trading partner. It is incredibly important from a security perspective. I mean, in every way, this is a incredibly important country for the United States. And there just were not these kind of mechanisms. Like politically, it was so that the binational relationship was so underdeveloped. And so the first customs ministerial was established in 2007. And then from there, there were a series of other bilateral mechanisms put in place. There was another mechanism called the 21st Century Border Management that came in I think 2010, 2011. And I worked on a lot of this, but it was largely new, which is incredible, right? That the United States and Mexico didn't have some process where the heads of their migration agencies met. It's the border where more migrants move back and forth than anywhere in the world. And it was all getting put in place. And so, and I think as you pointed to, Professor, once the mechanisms were in place, once there was that kind of dialogue, trust came as people were able to work with each other. And we were actually able to, put in place ways to deal with what had in the past been really, really difficult, controversial issues. One of the constant ones was Border Patrol use of force, where if a Border Patrol agent had fired on people in Mexico, I mean, these in the past had been international incidents, and we were able to set up a process where the people on the U.S. side would share what had happened in internal investigations, and they'd meet bilaterally with their counterparts, and it was still contentious, but it was a real process. And all that, it just took work. But it was staggering to me coming into this when I started on this in 2009, that none of this had been in place before. And that, this incredibly important partner of the United States was almost like within the US bureaucracy seen as a backwater. which that there's a whole set of biases and other things that go into that. But yeah, it's I think that there's there's a lot of what the previous assumptions I think that have led to a lot of organizational structures are being proved to be wrong, and I hope all of you are part of the are sort of leading the way to establish these new kinds of partnerships that go far beyond some of these old assumptions.
Yeah, thank you so much. So in short, there are no best practices in the world, but really what we know from observing many different situations across the world gives us ideas towards the creation of practices that are the best adapted to local situations, whether they're really local across the boundary line, or whether they're regional, whether they're national, or whether they're multinational or international. So if they apply to different regions of the world and so on and so forth.